Introducing Katie tonight. I don't do as good at this part as Pastor Darren does, but I could brag on Katie Brown for like hours, so it'll be okay. I won't do it for hours. But she is an amazing person. She trusts the Lord. Many of us look to her for guidance. Many of us trust her wisdom and her discernment and her ability. Like this morning when I was talking about black and white, Katie's able to see through that and understand complex issues, and to have conversations with her will help grow you. She has 3 kids, of course. Macy's able to be here. Parker is at work, and Kendall, I guess, is at home right now, not feeling great. So we can pray for him as well. And Pastor Darren, of course, is traveling back. Katie has spent her life as a social worker. She has just left the nursing home, though, transitioned to the elementary school. She is, I'm going to get your title wrong, but I think I know the idea of it, a social emotional learning teacher. So she is actually getting to teach our kids at the elementary school, those who are struggling with regulating their behavior. And we know that she is a blessing. And it's just another way that the church gets to love on the school. Katie is a locally licensed minister in the Church of the Nazarene. She has held that title for about a year now. So we thank the Lord for her. We are excited to be able to hear from her in just a few minutes. Pastor Kelsey is going to come, and she's going to read Katie's text for us.
Genesis chapter 45, verses 1 through 15. Then Joseph could no longer control himself before all his attendants, and he cried out, "Have everyone leave my presence." So there was no one with Joseph when he made himself known to his brothers. And he wept so loudly that the Egyptians heard him, and Pharaoh's household heard about it. Joseph said to his brothers, "I am Joseph. Is my father still living?" But his brothers were not able to answer him because they were terrified at his presence. Then Joseph said to his brothers, "Come close to me." When they had done so, he said, "I am your brother Joseph, the one you sold into Egypt. And now do not be distressed and do not be angry with yourselves for selling me here, because it was to save lives that God sent me ahead of you. For 2 years now there has been famine in the land, and for the next 5 years there will be no plowing and reaping. But God sent me ahead of you to preserve you, a remnant on earth, and to save your lives by a great deliverance. So then it was not you who sent me here, but God. He made me father to Pharaoh, lord of his entire household, and ruler of all Egypt. Now hurry back to my father and say to him, 'This is what your son Joseph says. God has made me lord of all Egypt. Come down to me. Don't delay. You shall live in the region of Goshen and be near me. You, your children, and your grandchildren, your flocks and herds, and all you have. I will provide for you there, because 5 years of famine are still to come. Otherwise, you and your household and all who belong to you will become destitute. You can see for yourselves, and so can my brother Benjamin, that it is really I who am speaking to you. Tell my father about all the honor accorded me in Egypt, and about everything you have seen, and bring my father down here quickly." Then he threw his arms around his brother Benjamin and wept, and Benjamin embraced him, weeping, and he kissed all his brothers and wept over them. Afterward, his brothers talked with him. The word of the Lord.
I think it's playing again. Brothers. No one pushes our buttons like a brother. Brothers will fight over anything: chores, toys, who started the fight. With boys, it is all about the pecking order. Who's the strongest? Who's the biggest? Who's the smartest? Who gets to call the shots? If you are the parent of boys, you know how quickly an argument can escalate. It will not surprise you to learn that Parker gave Kendall his first black eye, or that Darren once broke his hand punching Ryan. Brotherly rivalry is a theme woven all throughout Scripture. Cain and Abel, Jacob and Esau, the parable of the prodigal son, brotherly relationships that were marked by jealousy, competition, and even hatred. And then there is the story of Joseph. Joseph was his father's favorite, and he knew it. He paraded around in the fancy coat that Jacob had given him to make sure that his brothers knew it too. He was a tattler. In typical little brother fashion, he made sure Jacob knew all the dirt on his older brothers. They couldn't breathe wrong without Jacob hearing about it. And then there were the dreams. The entire family bowing down to Joseph. You would think that Joseph would have enough sense not to share those dreams with his brothers, but he did not. The brothers hated Joseph. They were jealous of the special relationship he had with their father. They were tired of feeling like they could never measure up. And the more the brothers stewed about it, the more it seemed to them that Joseph was the reason for everything that was wrong with their lives. Something had to be done. In a breathtaking escalation of the conflict, the brothers throw Joseph into a deep well, intending to kill him. It is only because of the feeble protests of brother Reuben that Joseph is not killed but sold to a roving band of Ishmaelites instead. Problem solved. Joseph may have started the conflict, but his brothers ended it, and they ended it decisively. Genesis tells us that Reuben was the only one who grieved Joseph's loss. He was the only one to grasp the enormity of what they had done. We are told nothing of the other brothers' reactions, only that they returned home, looked their father in the eye, and told the most terrible lie. Joseph was dead, they said, killed by a wild animal. They broke Jacob's heart and changed their family forever. This is a story about how messed up human relationships can get. There is so much in this story that we recognize from our own experiences with messed up relationships. How it is often the people who should love us the most who hurt us most deeply. People who share our lives, our history, even our blood. There is no one who can wound us like a brother. We understand all too clearly how a lack of control over our thoughts and emotions can swiftly escalate a conflict. We nurse our grudges and resentments until they become supersized. We wander down endless rabbit holes of speculation until the line between reality and imagination blurs beyond recognition. Rather than responding to others with thoughtfulness and careful reflection, we rush to conclusions and act on impulse, making the whole situation worse. This story serves as a reminder of the dangers of cultivating a victim mentality. We believe that because we've been wronged, we're justified in responding as we see fit, without self-restraint or regard for proportionality. It's ironic that the brothers, so certain of their victimhood, acted in ways far more destructive than anything Joseph ever did. Joseph's behavior, though frustrating, did not tear their family apart. It was the brothers' vengeful, disproportionate response that caused the rift. The conflict altered the course of everyone's lives. Joseph found himself captive in a strange country, far from family and friends. Once a beloved son, he was now a pawn in the schemes of those more powerful than him. But somehow Joseph ends up on his feet. His knack for interpreting dreams catches Pharaoh's attention. He warns Pharaoh that famine is coming and will destroy Egypt if preparations are not made. So Pharaoh gives Joseph the job, promoting him to second in command over all of Egypt. We have to imagine what life was like for the brothers after Joseph was gone. Scripture doesn't tell us much about that. I'm sure that when they sold him into slavery, their only thought was that they would finally be free of him, free of his tattling, free from his dreams, free from that ridiculous coat. But ironically, the absence of Joseph would come to define the family more than his presence ever had. The brothers must have been tormented by unanswered questions about what had happened to Joseph. Where was he? Was he still a slave? Was he even alive? They watched day after day as their father slowly succumbed to his grief, the sadness in his eyes a constant reminder of their deception. It must have been so difficult to live with that. Scripture tells us they lived like this for 22 years, trapped in a world of their own making with little hope that things could ever change. And yet, time has a way of softening even the hardest of hearts. In the beginning, the brothers were so sure that they had done the right thing, that their actions were justified. But as the years went by and their sense of outrage diminished, doubt and guilt began to creep in. Had they perhaps overreacted? Were Joseph's sins so intolerable, so egregious, that they warranted the breaking up of their family? We know what it's like to live in the space between conflict and reconciliation. It is a challenging space, filled with pain and sorrow. And yet, it is in this space that the most important work of reconciliation is done. It is in this space that we begin to change. Reconciliation is not just about restoring what was broken or going back to the way things were. It is about creating something completely new. It is first and foremost an act of imagination, because it involves envisioning a reality that is different from the one we currently experience. Imagination allows us to transcend the present moment and see the potential for healing and peace, even when circumstances seem bleak. It helps us to visualize a future where the relationship is transformed, not just repaired. If reconciliation is about creating something completely new, then that means we have to be completely new. For all the hurt that human conflict causes, it can also be a powerful motivator for growth, spiritual growth, emotional growth, growth of perspective. If we let it, conflict can reveal to us those things in our lives that cause pain to other people. Our pride and self-centeredness, our anger and need to control, our impatience and out-of-whack priorities, our hot-headedness. Like the brothers, sometimes it takes us a while to get to the place where we can acknowledge these things. Conflict creates anxiety inside of us, an anxiety that we want to resolve as quickly as possible. But the kind of change that leads to real transformation of the relationship takes time. That is not to say that we drag our feet or ignore the conflict. It just means that we should not rush through this in-between space too quickly. It is uncomfortable, I know, but it is necessary. Just as Joseph predicted, famine strikes Egypt and the surrounding communities, including Canaan. Jacob sends the brothers to Egypt to buy food. They find themselves standing before the second most powerful man in all of Egypt, unaware that he is their brother Joseph. But Joseph knows, and he does everything in his power to make their lives miserable. He accuses them of stealing from Pharaoh and throws them into prison. He eventually releases them, but then demands that they bring their brother Benjamin to him, Jacob's youngest son, his only remaining child by his wife, Rachel. The brothers protest, but when they once again run out of food, they have no choice but to do what Joseph has asked. They bring Benjamin to Egypt. To their horror, Joseph accuses Benjamin of stealing and sentences him to remain in Egypt forever. This is the brothers' undoing. Once again, they are responsible for the loss of a cherished son. They tear their clothes and cry out in Joseph's presence, "Surely God is punishing us. He has laid bare our sin from so many years ago." The entire Joseph narrative has led up to this moment. The sins of the past have reemerged in the present, and everything is turned upside down. After years of separation, the brothers now stand before Joseph, tormented with guilt and completely at Joseph's mercy. Joseph is now at the top of the pecking order. He is the strongest, the biggest, the smartest, and there is no doubt that he is the one calling all the shots. He has the power to destroy his brothers once and for all, and no one would blame him if he did it. All eyes are on Joseph. The brothers cower, anticipating the force of his anger. But no one expected what happened next. Joseph weeps. His gut-wrenching sobs reverberate through the palace like a shockwave, unnerving the brothers and all of Pharaoh's household. Joseph weeps for a father who has endured the greatest loss a parent can face, the loss of a beloved child. For his brothers, who for 22 years had lived with a crippling guilt and regret that overshadowed every good thing in their lives. He weeps for himself, for the injustices he has suffered, for the years of loneliness separated from the ones he loves. He weeps for the utter stupidity of it all. With his tears, every drop of anger and resentment melt away. And for the first time in this whole twisted, tragic story, there is perfect clarity. Theirs was not a story of sin and brokenness. It was a story of the goodness and graciousness of God. A God who is always at work for his purposes in spite of every human effort to thwart it. A God who can take the worst of human action and use it for their salvation. With tears streaming down his face, Joseph says to his brothers, "It is I, Joseph. Do not be afraid, for it was not you who sent me here, but God." Without Joseph, Jacob and his brothers would have starved to death. The line of Abraham, God's chosen instrument to bless the world and bring about its redemption, would have come to a sudden and untimely end. The suffering of millions of Egyptians, Canaanites, and others has been averted. Joseph considers all the events of the past 22 years and places them right where they belong, inside the goodness and providence of God. It is this reality that makes reconciliation possible. We can forgive not because we minimize the wrongdoing of others, not because we overlook the deep and lasting harm they have caused, but because at the end of things, it is all swept up into the arms of a loving Father who takes everything and makes it new. The struggle for us is that so often God's ways are hidden behind a facade of human activity. We look at the world around us and we are overwhelmed by the ugliness and hopelessness of it all. This is why we need faith. Faith to trust that beneath the surface, God is at work, transforming hearts and minds and building bridges across divides that seem insurmountable to us. Faith that one day the superficiality of human activity will be stripped away, revealing that God has made everything right. We know from the rest of the story that Joseph's relationship with his brothers was not perfect. We put too much stock in perfection, don't you think? I read once that perfection is the enemy of the good, and I think there's a lot of truth in that. But in spite of the flaws, Joseph and his brothers lived together peacefully for the rest of Jacob's life and buried him in Canaan just like he wanted, surrounded by all 12 of his sons. Thanks be to God.